A farmer in Florida, he had a very large pond down by his orchard. And one evening, he got a 5-gallon bucket to go out and pick some fruit in his orchard down by his pond. And as he came near the pond, he heard the voice of some females who were skinny dipping in his pond. And aware of his presence, they quickly swam to the deep end of the pond. And they yelled out, "We're not coming out until you leave." The old man said, "I didn't come here to see ladies skinny dipping in my pond. I came down here to feed the alligators." And the moral of that story is old men think fast. So, boy, it is such a complicated thing when you lose a spouse. I was introduced to a book called The Grieving Brain by a lady out in Southern California, Cindy Bostic. I sent her the manuscript for the third book I wrote, and I asked her for some feedback. She said, "You might want to get a hold of this book called The Grieving Brain before you put that book to print." And I'm so thankful that she introduced me to this book. This book is written by a neuroscientist who's also a psychologist who has studied for decades the effect of loss on the brain. And I want to read to you a section of that book. "Even when a person has been ill for a long time, no one knows what it will be like to walk through the world without this other person. My contribution as a scientist has been to study grief from the brain's perspective, from the perspective that the brain is trying to solve a problem faced with the absence of the most important person in our life. Grief is a heart-wrenchingly painful problem for the brain to solve, and grieving necessitates learning to live in the world with the absence of someone you love deeply who is ingrained in your understanding of the world. This means that for the brain, your loved one is simultaneously gone and also everlasting. And you are walking through two worlds at the same time. You are navigating your life despite the fact that they have been stolen from you, a premise that makes no sense to your brain and is confusing and upsetting to your brain." You know, some people look at grieving generally and then grieving the loss of your spouse as a purely emotional experience, and it's not. It's a mental experience as well. It not only has an impact on you emotionally, it has an impact on you. It has an impact on you both emotionally and mentally. Let me share with you some things as we begin this session. A lady wrote a book called A Widow's Guide to Healing. She said, "When I lost my husband, Roy, it was as if I entered into another universe. I wasn't only grief-stricken, I was disoriented, terrified, and completely at a loss as to what I was supposed to do next. Although I wasn't on any medication, I felt like I was in a coma. I could hear what was going on. My body was present, but my mind was elsewhere." There's a brother, Bill Goodpasture, who's preached for years, who's retired now and lives in Cookeville, Tennessee, and he shared this with me. "A real marriage is about sharing, and the widower no longer has someone to unload his life with. Children are great, friends are fine, but it's never the same as what a husband and wife share. Dear Janice, wish you were here, but glad you are there." A widow in Glasgow, Kentucky wrote this: "I'm sitting here crying my eyes out. I really thought I was beyond the questioning and the intense hurt, but I feel like a knife has been driven through my heart." A man who's preached for a number of years and also been a teacher in the public school system said after his wife passed away, "Now I am alone in a time I do not understand. It is a lonely world of darkness and I no longer fit into it. I have no one to care for but myself. The one I devoted my life to is now gone." He said, "Frankly, my life stopped that day. This is not the way we planned it. My whole life was gone. She was not supposed to die before me. We held hands constantly for 55 years. We thoroughly discussed everything we did. She laid out my clothes every morning to make sure that we matched. Can you imagine the struggle that he had getting dressed every morning after that experience being married with a wife like that? He said, I eat out very little. Sunday was our day out. Someone at church will ask me to join them, and I accept once in a while. I always go when the church has an eating event, but who do I sit with? If I sit with a family, their conversations do not allow me to join in. This is because I really do not fit in. And then there's a book out there called The Other Side of Grief, Getting to the Other Side of Grief. It's written by a nurse and a guy with pastoral counseling background. And the nursing background female author said in that book, I wanted to kill myself. Going to bed alone at night was so hard, I prayed that God would let me die. I wanted out of this life. A lady who wrote a book called The Confessions of a Mediocre Widow said, during the first year, it seemed like I was in a constant state of emotional agony. I would sit with a photo album in my lap and I would flip through the pages of pictures of a man that I couldn't believe was actually gone. There is a sister, Stapleton, who was married to Robert Stapleton. Some of you may even know her. They were a Texas couple. They were married for 47 years, and Robert and his wife were missionaries in Tanzania for many years. After Robert passed away, about 2 years after Robert passed away, she shared this with me. She said, I have to do the best I can each day, and I know that. But it is hard at times. I never dreamed it would be this difficult. I share that with you because she was not just what I would call an average Christian. She had been the wife of a preacher and a missionary for years. But after 2 years, she's still struggling with his absence. One Arkansas sister in the Lord said, I miss him so much. Knowing he is in heaven doesn't stop the pain and the loneliness of the one that's left behind. Another lady in Arkansas said, I wasn't a person anymore. Couples turned their backs on me. It is a very difficult thing living solo in a coupled world. If you deny or think that this is not a coupled world, let me offer to you a couple of personal experiences that I've had. A friend of mine and I, the friend was a female, we were checking our bags in Albuquerque, New Mexico, I believe it was, and I had to move some stuff out of one bag into another because of the 50-pound limit, and he reached out and took the things that I needed to exchange, and he said, here, give those to me and I'll give them to your wife. The woman I was traveling with was to my right. His assumption was we were married. We live in a coupled world. At the Freed-Hardeman University lectureship, I came up to a vendor space, and as I approached that vendor space, and during the time that I was married, when I was at that lectureship every year, I would buy something at that vendor space to take home to my wife. As I approached that vendor space, the woman at the vendor space said, now you want to make sure that you get something to take home to your wife before you leave the lectureship. See, the assumption was I was married. We live in a coupled world, but not everybody is coupled. So there are people who've gone through divorce who are living solo. There are people who have lost their spouse who are living solo. There are people who have never been married. There are almost 500,000 people in our culture, in our country, who have never been married before. We live in a coupled world, but not everybody is coupled. No offense to those of you who are here who are widowed, but this is my favorite widow. Her name is Millie. I met her in Cincinnati, Ohio. She took me out to lunch, and she even paid the bill. I like women who are like that. She's 93. I think she was 93 years old when she took me out to this Japanese restaurant. And when we ordered our meal, the waiter walked away, and I said, Millie, tell me about your story. I said, tell me about your love and loss story. And so she told me about this man that she was married to for 63 years. She told me about how he was as a father, and she talked about their marriage, and she talked about him getting cancer, and she talked about caregiving for him, and then him dying. And then after she told me that story of being married to that guy for 63 years, she said, but that wasn't my first husband. And I was shocked. And she could tell I was shocked. And I said, well, Millie, tell me about your first husband. She said, well, I was 19 years old, and we already had one child who was a little over a year old, and I was pregnant with our second child, and Ray Farmer is his name. Ray was in General Patton's army in the Battle of the Bulge, and he died. And she said, and I'll quote exactly what she said after that. She said, I had him buried in France, a decision that to this day I regret. I've often thought about her and about, imagine 19 years old, being pregnant, already having one child, a little over a year old, and the mid-1940s. How did Millie ever cope with that experience? And a lot of times I find my encouragement in learning about other people's stories that to me are very inspirational. And so sometimes I will think, if Millie did this, I can do this. If Marlene lost her husband, Addo, and she lived after that, I can do this. If Frank lost his wife, and he's living afterwards, I can do this. If you're a widowed person, I want to give you something a little different to think about. Instead of feeling like you have a W on your chest, as if that was something to be ashamed of or something to hide, be proud of it. You know what you did if you're widowed? You hoed your row all the way to the end. Not everybody does that, but you did it. And that last several feet of that hoeing may have been terribly exhausting. A very scary time in your life, and maybe the worst time in your life prior to the death of your spouse. If you're widowed, that's something to be proud of, not something to be ashamed of. Because that means you hoed your row all the way to the end. Don't ever hide the fact that you're widowed. As a matter of fact, that loss can be the pain that you can use to help somebody else. Don't waste your pain. Use your experience to help other people. In Lufkin, Texas, there's a lady named Katrina who's married to one of the elders there now. And Katrina texted me one time, one Sunday after I came home from church after preaching one Sunday, and she said, Dean, I want to share with you what I did today. Katrina was in her 50s and had already been widowed twice. And she said, Dean, I went after church, after the amen, I went to a couple of young ladies, and I encouraged them to love their husbands, to treasure their marriage, to be awesome mothers. You know what Katrina said to those two young ladies that day, I'm sure was much more powerful than some guy in a suit and tie behind a pulpit who said the very same thing, because they knew she had experience. Some of you maybe have gone to the first Spider-Man movie where the uncle told the boy, with great power comes great responsibility. With great loss comes great influence. You can have a powerful influence in the lives of other people if you're willing to share your story with other people. What are the risk factors in regard to getting widowed? Well, you have to say, I do. You have to stick with it, and then you have to stay married and keep living, and you're it. You may have remembered that Brother Harry, when I was reading something that he had shared with me, he said, it wasn't supposed to be this way. I was supposed to die before her. I wish I had $1 for every widowed person who came to me saying, we thought the other person would go first. We don't get a choice about that. I want to ask you to think out loud with me now together about things that in our culture we commonly associate with being widowed. Give me things that you commonly associate with being widowed in our culture. Now, let me start with one, old. Now, have we debunked that myth? I've shared with you stories of people in their 20s and 30s who've lost their spouse. But that is some of the thinking of our culture. Widowhood is something that old people experience. Well, there are a lot of old people who are widowed, true. But it's not simply old people who are widowed. Now, give me some other things that our culture associates with being widowed. Give me at least 5 or 6. Come on now. Unemployment. You know, I was just talking to a brother. Raise your hand for those of you who are visiting. Over here, we've got a guy who's worked with people who have issues with life after loss financially. What is the name of the position that you hold there, what you do? Senior risk advisor? And he consults with people and counsels people in regard to financial things. There are financial things, and unemployment would be a financial problem that some widowed people might experience. The U.S. Census Bureau says that widowed females are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience poverty than elderly women who are married. Elderly women who are widowed are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience poverty than elderly women who are married. There are a lot of risk factors, financial risk factors, that can go with widowhood. How about something else that you'd associate with widowhood? Helpless. There's a lot of things that you can feel helpless about. Martha called me one evening, and in the course of the conversation, she said, "I hate being a man." And I thought, now, I have a wife. I had a wife for 41 years and 3 daughters, so I'm a messed up male. I call it, my medical diagnosis is I suffer from overexposure to the female gender. I have a hard time understanding females because I'm so messed up. So Martha says, "I hate being a man." And I said, Martha, she's a Christian lady, now remarried. I said, "Martha, what do you mean by that?" She said, "I hate doing what he did." And dumb me, I had to dig deeper. Like what? She said, "I hate taking the trash out to the curb every week. I just hate that." There are things, you can feel so overwhelmed and so helpless because where you shared things together, duties, responsibilities, and things went smoothly, now it's all on you. And you can feel very helpless sometimes. Give me something else that you'd associate with widowhood. Loneliness. Probably the most difficult thing to deal with is the loneliness. Some of you, I'm sure, remember Kathy Lee Gifford, who was on NBC Today Show for a number of years. When she was interviewed by the Tennessean newspaper in Nashville, Tennessee, because she moved from the New York area down to Middle Tennessee, Franklin, Tennessee, as a matter of fact. In the Tennessean newspaper, when she was being interviewed, she said, "I moved here because I was dying of loneliness." There's a difference between feeling lonely and then feeling like you're dying of loneliness. Now, I'm sure you think I shouldn't be getting the AARP magazine. I'm not old enough yet. But anyway, in an issue of the AARP magazine, she was interviewed. They were married for 29 years. Frank Gifford, who was a great halfback for the New York Giants NFL football team. He died in 2015. They'd been married for 29 years. And when she was interviewed by the AARP magazine, when she talked about her loneliness, she said she had crippling loneliness. See, there's a difference between the loneliness that we would experience typically and the loneliness we would experience from the loss of a beloved mate. So loneliness is a big issue. Give me a couple more. Oh, you're at the mercy of the mechanics. Do you mean you can't trust them? You can't always trust a mechanic. Women generally can be taken advantage of. Men can be taken advantage of too, but sometimes, there are some people who take advantage of a person's gender or a person's marital status, and you can be in jeopardy of being taken advantage of. Yeah. Let me share with you several that we'll do in almost rapid fire succession. Now, you lose your spouse, you're going to grieve. So if you're crying in the presence of somebody else because of something you hear, something you smell, or somewhere you are, what do you say if you start to tear up in the presence of somebody else? I'm sorry. What do you have to be sorry for? Absolutely nothing. As a matter of fact, you tearing up in the presence of somebody else could be a very educational experience for that somebody else, because they need to know that that is a very natural and normal response for the vast majority of us. Because of my overexposure to the female gender, I have a tendency to do that more than most males. I was sitting in my granddaughter's 5th grade graduation on Tuesday of this week, fighting back the tears, thinking about how proud that my wife would have been, how proud Nana would have been of Brooklyn's experience of graduating from that school. And there are times it hits you, at times you don't expect it. There are times like anniversaries or certain dates that you just naturally anticipate that, but then there are times that can be extremely difficult. As a matter of fact, the 2 hardest places for a widowed person to go, I've done my survey work. I can say this without fear of contradiction. The 2 most difficult places for widowed people to go often is number 1, to bed, and number 2, this room, going to church. Going to bed is an in-your-face reminder of the fact that you are A-L-O-N-E exclamation mark. That's a really hard thing to get used to. I have a private Facebook group that's exclusively for people who've lost their spouse who are members of the church. And I remember about one discussion we had a few years ago about how do you handle that? How do you handle going to bed by yourself after years of going to bed with somebody you love dearly? It's a challenge. There is a book back there on the display table called Don't Take My Grief Away. It's written by Doug Manning. We need to make it a point to grieve as long as we need to, in whatever way we need to, and nobody has the right to tell you how to do it or when to stop. Whether it's a loving child or a brother or sister in the Lord. People grieve in their own way, at their own pace, and we need to permit them to do that and encourage them to do it, and do it without any sense of shame or disgrace. You don't have to say, I'm sorry, when you tear up. Let the tears flow wherever you are. It's okay. Now, there's some people that lose their spouse and they feel relief. That seems like a direct opposite. In what kind of a circumstance could you lose your spouse and feel relief? Can you give me a few? There's more than one. Okay, what if they've been ill, and maybe in ill and in pain for a long time, and they're a faithful Christian? Where are they? Remember what Bill Goodpasture said? Dear Janice, I wish you were here, but I'm glad you're there. Yeah. Can you think of another relief situation after you lose your spouse? How about if that spouse was abusive? How about if that spouse was an alcoholic? How about if that spouse had been multiply unfaithful to you? There are times that people experience loss and they feel as much or more relief than they do grief, and that's okay too. But if you're feeling relief when you should be feeling, you think, grief, how does that make you feel about yourself? You're guilty because you should be feeling grief, but you feel relief. It's a very difficult emotional experience and mental experience after loss. And you've got the tears and the no tears. And do you know there's some people who can't cry? Physiologically, they cannot cry. And that's okay too. You've got a heartache that you are going to experience that you've never experienced before, and you're going to have some questions that you have never asked, but you're going to ask them now. And those questions may be about your brothers and sisters in the Lord and how they're reacting to you or not interacting with you. You may have questions about God. You may have questions about yourself. As a matter of fact, you may have a faith struggle. You know that guy in Mark chapter 9 who brought his demon-possessed son to Jesus, crying out to Jesus for healing? He said, "Lord, I believe," but what did he follow that up with? "Help my unbelief." It's okay if you have a faith struggle. You're just a human being. That's all you are. You're a Christian, but you still have to be a human being. And it's going to be a struggle sometimes because things that you experience in life may really cause you to have questions and thoughts that you've never had before. If you have a faith struggle and you address that faith struggle in the right way and you seek the right kind of assistance for that faith struggle, are you going to be stronger or weaker? Well, you may feel weaker in the midst of the struggle, but how are you going to be after the struggle? You're going to be stronger. You're going to be wiser. It's okay to go to a brother and sister in the Lord and admit the fact that you have some serious faith issues. It's okay to walk down this aisle and tell the whole church that you need their prayers because you are really struggling about your relationship with God and your attitude about God. It's okay to let other people know that you're struggling because you know what? Other people are struggling too. And when we are private to a fault, we're not going to be able to effectively minister to one another. The loneliness is unparalleled, and you're going to have an identity crisis because if you are someone's husband or someone's wife, what are you after they die? Or if you are half of a whole and the whole no longer exists, what are you? You've got an identity crisis. And you know that identity crisis, there are, I can even read you a quote out of one book I have in this folder that I don't have time to read to you, where she says basically, I don't like that word. She's talking about the word widow. I don't like that word, and I will not check that box to identify myself. Well, being a widow is not your identity. Being a widower is not your identity. Being a cancer patient is not your identity. Being a person who's experienced divorce, being a divorcee is not your identity. Being a senior citizen is not your identity. Your identity is you exist in the image of God, you live in the likeness of God, and that doesn't change. That is your identity. It's not anything that you experience. It's not your circumstances. Your identity is your relationship with God. Don't ever let your circumstances identify you or define you. There can be financial jeopardy involved. If you think Social Security is the answer to the problem of being widowed, you're naive and or ignorant. It can be a real struggle for the widowed after the loss of their spouse. What you're having to deal with is somebody forcing you to deal with something that you don't want. Some changes. Did anybody move here to the Wiley, Texas area from some other state? Okay, were you forced to do that or did you choose to do that? Okay, we have changes that we choose. And that's okay, and that's a whole lot easier, but it's still a change that's difficult to navigate. Well, sometimes in life you are forced to deal with things. You ladies, this by the way is not an engagement ring box, okay? Let me clarify that. Okay, this box, okay, let's think about a gift. Ladies, what if you were given a gift that you didn't want? See, that's what life does to you. Sometimes life gives you a gift you don't want. What are you going to do with a gift you don't want, ladies? You guys can take a nap here for a minute because you're clueless about this stuff. Most of us guys are not that observant about this. Oh, okay, ladies, what are you going to do with this gift you don't want? Re-gift it, okay? Very smart. Because that way you don't have to buy a gift. You know, you just give them a gift you didn't pay for that somebody else gave you. Very smart. Now, there's other ways of dealing with it. Besides re-gifting it, what are you going to do? Do what? Take it back. Take it back and get some money for it. Then go buy something you really want.
Put it on a shelf.
Put it on a shelf. How about a closet where you can't even see it, okay? Then when are you going to find it? 25 years later when you move? Oh, I remember this was the ugliest thing I've ever been given. There are times in life that you're gifted loss. Now, more often, we're gifted with blessings. But sometimes life gifts us with burdens. What do you want to do with the burdens? You want to give your burden to somebody else? Can you put it in a closet and forget about it? Can you take it and exchange it? Nope, you're stuck with it. It's a thing that you are stuck with the rest of your life. So if you've been diagnosed with cancer, you're stuck with that the rest of your life. You've been diagnosed with cancer. Even if you go into remission, you've been diagnosed with cancer. That's just a reality. It's like if you've lost a limb, a physical limb of your body, you're an amputee. That's not your identity. That's not who you are, but that's a part of your life. And widowhood is too. Sometimes you're just forced to deal with things you don't want to deal with. There's also the absence of the person that you have to deal with. When you look at where that person sits in the house, what do you see? An empty chair. And then you dream. Just recently I had a dream, and my loss was 9 years ago Christmas morning. So I'm about 9.5 years down the road now. And I had a dream about my wife. That's not an uncommon thing for people who've lost their spouse to have dreams about their spouse years and years, 15, 20 years after they've died. Where does your brain go when you're awake? Now, you try to control it, right? But sometimes it goes places you don't want, right? And you try to reel it in. When you go to sleep, how much control over your brain do you have? It's going to go wherever it wants to. And dreams are not something that you should think are an indication of the fact you're going crazy because they've died and they're not here anymore. You're dreaming because you're human, and you're going to have to deal with the silence at the house. You're going to have to deal with the emptiness in your life. You're going to have to deal with the reality of the fact that you are dependent to a certain degree. One lady, in writing about widowhood, said what a person who's lost their spouse ought to do is appoint a board of directors for their life. You get to be the president of the board. For me, it was my 3 daughters. They get to offer their opinion, then I get to decide, okay? So you have feedback. You know, you need somebody in your life to help you, like, for instance, if you are having car issues, have a go-to person to help you with that. If you have spiritual issues, you need to have a spiritual mentor or helper. If you're having problems maybe with the house, or you're having some problems physically, what do? You find assistance with a doctor. We have dependence. Nobody knows everything about anything, so we are dependent. We need to recognize that and then accept the help that we have at our access with other people in our lives. And then we're going to deal with stress that we haven't had before, and we're going to deal with anger. But who in the world would we be angry at? What is there to be angry about? The person died. Now, assuming they didn't take their own life, why are you going to be angry at that person? There's a lady in Florida. She said after she lost her husband, when she got in the shower, she would beat the walls of the shower sometimes, and she would scream, "Why did you leave me? Why did you leave me?" That is not an uncommon thing. See, but we don't talk about this kind of stuff. People are not aware of that. I was not aware of this until I started talking to a lot of widowed people and reading a lot of what widowed people write about. There can be anger toward the medical profession. Do you know there are doctors who make mistakes? Just like there are teachers and preachers who make mistakes. And sometimes that's the reason why people die. Sometimes you can be angry at the medical profession. Can you imagine somebody being angry with God? If you come tomorrow morning, I'll tell you about a time I was angry with God and really didn't recognize it and didn't know it until a song at church got announced. And when I looked at that song, I said, I ain't singing that song. No way. Boy, there are sometimes some phases in your life where you experience some things that they will have an impact on you that you never dreamed and never imagined that you would ever go through. There can be anger even about the person who has left. You can be angry with yourself because maybe you contributed to it. A lady by the name of Anita blamed herself for her husband's death because she got COVID. She said, I gave COVID to my husband. I survived and he died. You can worry and have fears about a lot of things because your life has been turned upside down and round, and you're kind of like that house in the story of the Wizard of Oz, and it's just spinning around, and you want to know where it's going to land. And it's a scary thing. And there's going to be some restless nights and restless days and some tossing and some turning. And I really appreciated this 80-something-year-old man who came to me in Chester, West Virginia, and he said, Dean, there's something I think you should add to that list that's not on that list. And I said, what is that? He said, suicidal thoughts. Now, I saw on the board out there, over 300 people were here last Sunday. In a group of 300 people in this room, if you think that there wasn't a single person that hadn't thought about suicide in recent times, you're probably naive. Because it's thought about a whole lot more than it's experienced. Life circumstances can have such an impact on you. Again, you'll say things you've never thought about saying, think things you never dreamed you would think, feel things that you don't want to feel. And you can become a person that you don't want to be. It is so difficult. It's only one relationship identified like this in the Bible. One flesh, only one. The parent-child relationship's not identified like this, but marriage is one flesh. This is a really special relationship, and this is how you make it work. You can't take two flawed people and create something perfect, but you can take two imperfect people and you can create something magnificent when you've got two people who say, no matter what, we're going to live this way, total giving, the total self for a total lifetime. You can have a magnificent marriage. We need to teach our kids that. We need to teach our grandchildren this, our great-grandchildren this. We need to help them understand that marriage is all about an all-in kind of philosophy on the part of two people as long as they breathe. When you lose something like that, it's going to do a number on you. But it's going to be different for you than it is for other people. And that's why you should never say to somebody, I know how you feel. We're all individual people. We have different thoughts and different feelings. We've had different experiences with our spouses. There are different kinds of relationships. Families are different. Some families are very private. They don't like to talk, even amongst themselves. They don't like to talk. They don't communicate. They have very poor communication habits. Some families are very open and very upfront and very transparent in their communication. Some people have been married over 1,300 days. Then some people have been married for decades. There's a lot of things that are going to affect your life after your loss. Some people have no faith. Some people have a lot of faith. Some people have some faith. But no matter how much faith you have, you are going to grieve. And you need to grieve in your way as long as you need to, because it's your journey. Now, Cheryl Wayne is going to pass out a gift from the Widowhood Workshop Ministry to you. Now, I wouldn't call this gift priceless because I buy them at the Dollar Tree store that needs to be renamed the $1.25 store. Raise your hand if you're widowed. Raise your hand if you're widowed as Cheryl Wayne makes his way around. What it is it's a fork. Now, we're fixing to have lunch after this session. Now, if you want to lose weight, you can eat with this fork, okay? You don't need, hey, by the way, the WW on my shirt does not stand for Weight Watchers. I mean, that's pretty obvious. It stands for Widowhood Workshop. Now, when you pick up a fork, what have you decided to do? Eat. Okay, now, tell me about some decisions you're going to make with that fork in your hand. What am I going to eat? Okay. What else are you going to think about? How about how much I'm going to eat? What I'm going to eat, how much I'm going to eat. So we've decided to eat, what we're going to eat, how much we're going to eat, when we're going to quit, we're making all kinds of decisions with that fork in our hand, right? Now, if you're widowed, make sure you get one of these forks. And what I want you to do is I want you to take this fork home and put it somewhere where you're going to see it every day. Let this fork remind you that in your life after loss, your journey after life that has experienced loss, you've got decisions to make. What are you going to do with the rest of your life? That's your decision. You've got to make a decision about that. No matter what you think, life goes forward. It doesn't stop, but it doesn't go backward. It goes forward. Now, how it goes forward with you, or how you go forward with life, is up to you. You've got to make a decision about the rest of your life. I highly recommend this philosophy over here on the wall. Don't die until you're dead. Because I'm telling you what, there are a lot of widowed people who will admit this to you. When you've lost somebody really precious in your life, you're going to feel dead. You may even want to die. I remember talking to my children about this issue, and I told them that I could relate a lot more to what Paul said in Philippians chapter 1 about for me to die is gain. And he expressed a preference to be with the Lord. That's exactly how I felt for a good while after my wife passed away. I would have rather the Lord taken me. Those first few years were a very difficult struggle. I had to come to realize that she was dead, I wasn't. That I had to take charge of my life, and I had to move forward with my life. So I did a lot of praying, more passionately than I ever had before. I prayed that the Lord, number one, would open a door of opportunity for me to continue to be a servant of His. I'd already resigned from the local preacher work at that church after 33 years to help care for my wife. So I was kind of up a creek without a paddle, unemployed. Now, I needed a door of opportunity to be opened. So I prayed about that. I prayed that the Lord would give me the vision to see the open door. Sometimes the Lord opens doors of opportunities. We don't see them. Sometimes we don't see them because we're so preoccupied, either with the mundane busyness of our life or maybe with our deep grieving in our life. We don't recognize them. So I prayed the Lord would open a door of opportunity for me, that He would give me the vision to see the open door, and He would give me the courage to walk through the open door without a woman that I'd come to dearly love and appreciate since I was a teenager. You know how hard it is for a 61-year-old guy to go church shopping, to find a church that will take you in? I know I needed to get in the southeast part of the country because that's where my daughters and where my grandchildren were, and I told them this in January of 2014. But I said, girls, as you go home and I try to find a place to relocate, I said, you've got to remember that this is going to be very difficult. I said, I've got 3 strikes against me, and in baseball that's not good, and it's not good in church shopping either. Number 1, strike 1, I'm 61 years old. It's hard to find a job for a 61-year-old preacher. Strike 2, I was a widower. I didn't have a wife. If you look at a lot of the what we call classified ads, like in the Brotherhood, almost the first thing is a married man with 2.5 children, one of them being a teenager. There are things that we have reduced the marketability of sometimes our acceptance of preachers. And one of them is age, and one of them is marital status. So I said, girls, I'm 61 years old, I'm a widower, and strike 3, I'm a Yankee, trying to find a job in the southeast part of the country. And I said, this is going to be very difficult. And it was very difficult. You know where I ended up? In a little place called Murray City, Tennessee, population 650. The whole county population was less than the city of Wiley, Texas, 14,600. Bunch of cotton farmers, soybean farmers. They took me in. I think One of the reasons they took me in is they were a grieving church because they had gone through a terrible loss. They weren't the church they used to be. They went from a church of about 120 to a church of about 50-something. And they were grieving that they weren't a church they used to be. I was a broken preacher, and we were a good match. We started a local widowhood ministry there. We started with me and about 4 widowed females, and we had monthly fellowships. And we got to the point where we had over 30, over 40, and sometimes over 50 people, half of whom were not members of the church, who came to these fellowships. And as a result of that, there were people who came back to the Lord from waywardness and people who were baptized. And we launched the Widowhood Workshop Ministry in large part because of that little church with a big heart in Murray City, Tennessee. Helen Keller said, when one door of happiness closes, another opens, but often, and she's so right, we look so long at the closed door, we do not see the one that's been opened for us. Whenever we've lost our spouse, we're going to deeply grieve, and we're going to stare in disbelief at a door that's been shut. It's been slammed shut. It's not only been slammed shut, it's been locked, and you can't get past it. And you've got to deal with something you don't want to deal with. And that can be a real struggle. Deep grieving is staring at that door in disbelief, and you have to do that. That's a very therapeutic thing. But at some point in time in that grief journey, you've got to see the fork in the road. You've got to get a grip and think, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? So what am I going to do? Well, you're released or free no matter how you feel. Now, I've had many widowed people, and I'll bet there's some in this room right here, who have told me, Dean, I still feel married. I personally can't relate to that because I didn't feel that way, but there are a lot of widowed people who feel that way after they've lost their spouse. I still feel married. We've got to remember, though, that our feelings are not always consistent with reality. God says in His perspective, which is the only one that matters, you are released or free, you are not married. Now, whether or not you want to check the widowed box or not, if you'd rather check the single box instead, it's okay, I guess. But the reality is, you are released or free. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, people who are not married are described in some very positive ways. They have a unique circumstance in their life. They're not totally without care, but they're without care in regard to things that have to do with the marriage. There are cares that go with being married. We can focus more on the cares of the Lord because we're without distraction. As a matter of fact, there is a book back there on the display table that is a book called The Undistracted Widow. Once you do get a grip, what you can find is that you have a unique situation in your life. You're more now available than you ever were before. You are more flexible than you ever were before, and you're more experienced than you ever were before because you were married and because you lost that precious person in your life. Isn't that weird how that loss ends up creating gains? It does. Loss ends up creating gains. Now, I have experience that I didn't want, I didn't choose to have, but life gifted me that, and so I've learned from those experiences. I'm also more flexible now. My wife would have never consented to have moved to Murray City, Tennessee, and I'll tell you why. She would have been 30 minutes away from the nearest Walmart in Jackson, Tennessee. My wife loved to shop. She wasn't a big buyer, but she was a good shopper. There was something, the smell of, is there something about the smell of sale tags or something? And she just loved to do that kind of thing. And she could traipse around and just walk around in a store for hours. I used to pridefully say that I had more mall mileage on my pedometer than any male on the face of the earth. She just would not have consented to us going to Murray City, Tennessee. But I went there because I was more flexible to do that. And I found that church to be a real blessing. Widowhood's not just a time of grief. It's a time of transition, adjustment, and opportunity, but there is a lot of grieving that we've got to do, but we need to do it effectively, and hopefully you've learned a little bit about that. What you want to do is create a new normal, a new beginning. Now, you can't do that right away. You can't even think straight about that. But what I wanted to do was create a new normal for myself. What you need to do is, what do you want to do with the rest of your life, and then how do you get there? And you have to decide, what do I want for my new normal, and then how do I get there? For some people, it's going to be maybe remarriage. They really, really, really want to be married again. And that can be done cautiously and carefully and very successfully. It can also be done very unwisely and can be a train wreck. One of the sessions that you can find on YouTube, if you'd like, you can find this on YouTube, is some sessions I've done about marriage and remarriage after loss. It can be a very complicated thing. But what do you want to do? Do you want to relocate? What ministry are you going to be involved in the church? God didn't save us just to come worship in a church building. God saved us to serve. So what ministry are you going to do? Probably you were involved in the ministry with your spouse to some degree. What are you going to do now that you're alone? So there's a lot of new beginning and new normal things that you have to figure out. But this is the bottom line. It's going to be whatever you want to make it, whatever you want to create for yourself. But the responsibility is on the person who's experienced the loss. And that's a very, very difficult thing to work with for the years after your loss. I want to thank you for spending time this morning with me. I'm hungry. I was hungry before this session started. So we're going to go ahead and take our break for lunch. I hope that if you're not a member of the church here, I hope you'd be interested in maybe coming tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning we're going to be talking about in Bible class about how we need to learn to praise the Lord no matter what's going on in our life. That's not always easy to do. And then we're going to do a study of Psalm 31 in our worship time about what we ought to do when we're overwhelmed. And I think it'll be very, not only biblical, but it'll be very practical for you. So I hope you can come back tomorrow. I want to thank you for coming. If you're not coming back tomorrow, or if maybe some reason you are not able to come back tomorrow, if you are a member of the church here, just thank you. You've invested some of your life in this, and I really appreciate that. Brother Steve?